My name is Michael Guy, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Matthew Pines. Going to be hitting on a lot of interesting topics when it comes to AI, China, regulation, all kinds of things here. But Matt, introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you? Which background as you get involved in your profession, and what are you doing currently?
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me. So I'm the director for security intelligence at the Krebs Stamos Group, which is a geopolitical and cybersecurity risk advisory firm. We mostly help engage multinationals with their kind of a couple between geopolitical and cybersecurity risk. I've been a consultant, I work in national security space, emerging technology for about 15 years, backgrounds in physics and philosophy. And yeah, happy to talk about any and all those topics.
Has cybersecurity gotten more robust or more fragile as all this AI stuff has been taking place?
Well, there's been a lot of speculation about potential implications of generative AI in particular, which is sort of the latest incarnation of the hype cycle around AI. On cybersecurity, right now, we haven't seen like direct applications in terms of the tool sets for adversaries, making it into kind of the mainstream. There's some speculation that it may help enable certain things like spear phishing attacks. You can sort of better sort of simulate and help kind of penetrate the soft tissue surrounding technical systems, which is usually human beings, and convince them they're talking to someone real, and help scale those types of spear phishing attacks or social engineering attacks. And there's been some indications of that happening, but nothing really substantial that's sort of strategically changed kind of the capabilities. Overall, though, cybersecurity is becoming increasingly complicated, and there's always an arms race between kind of offense and defense. And any new technology is always going to be deployed by all actors in that ecosystem. So on the offensive side, as I just mentioned, kind of in the spear phishing and in kind of social engineering, but also in terms of helping to automate and, lower the bar for generating kind of, what you would call like script kiddie type attacks, sort of, relatively less sophisticated sort of use of existing malware and scripts to sort of automate and scale different types of sort of, cybersecurity attacks. So in the sort of, I would say kind of the financially motivated threat actor space, there's probably going to be a lot of experimentation in the next few years. Folks that are, constantly trying to find, a competitive advantage in that market, which essentially functions as like ransomware as a service, where a lot of, different folks that have skills sort of sell their skills. And in these marketplaces, people are specializing in, getting kind of what are called like initial access brokers, sort of selling 0 days or persistence that they have on certain corporate networks, selling that in ecosystems, people willing to pay for it. A pretty thriving sort of criminal marketplace. And then on the defensive side, there is a lot of innovation going into using AI to help with detection, looking for anomalous events that happen on networks, just try to, be acting at the speed of the machines. And so, yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in this space, but it's going to be hard to tell right now whether it's going to lead to, an advantage on either the offensive or defensive side for now.
But I get the sense the AI talk is largely because now it's more accessible in terms of effectively sales copy and things like ChatGPT in terms of getting responses. The generative AI, correct me if I'm wrong, has probably been around for a lot longer than people may be aware.
Yeah, certainly there's been, GPT 2 and 3 and then 3.5 and then GPT 4 that was just released a few months ago. And so that's been kind of the inflection point in kind of consumer adoption of these tools. Now that they can actually generate, pretty effective sort of simulacrums of sophisticated human output in a lot of different media, especially text and code. And so in particular in the cybersecurity space, or even just in general computer engineering, the use of things like Copilot for helping with sort of programmers certainly taken off quite dramatically in the past few months, where folks that, work on pretty general programming tasks find that they can use essentially like a really sophisticated autocomplete to help them generate code that's like reasonably good and sort of accelerates the productivity of lots of different programming tasks. And so if you are in the computer sort of malware production business, this might help enable your activities as well.
So you'd use that term competitive advantage. And I'm going to make the assumption that as AI becomes more of a thing, the competitive advantage probably goes to the country that has the most lax structure around legal frameworks, right? I mean, China can do whatever it wants, US not so much, even though there's a lot of companies trying to move past the regulators. How does regulation factor into competitive advantages on the country level when it comes to AI?
You're really touching on kind of what is a key issue emerging right now in the sort of the global regulatory regime that is sprouting up around generative AI in particular. It is sort of the subject of intense debate and sort of negotiation between really at this point, three main actors in that system are the EU, the US, and the UK as kind of this sort of joint group that has the leading AI companies right now, and then China. And so there's a lot of competitive bargaining and negotiation and positioning, both around the regulatory space, but also on the actual underlying technology and the full value chain that goes into that technology. And so I think we're going to see a lot of movement over the next few months and years as each country tries to sort of wield their specific advantages in that space. So right now, the US and the UK have by far the most advanced actual technology, especially in generative AI, with the leading companies, whether it's OpenAI, DeepMind, Anthropic, et cetera. They have the most sort of cutting edge large language models. They have access to the most advanced sort of compute clusters, and they're really leading sort of this leapfrogging this particular application of AI technology. The EU is trying to counter that technology lead by wielding what, in their view, they have as the sort of regulatory superpower. They have a history of, applying pretty stringent regulations on technology and taking advantage of the fact that they can they can generate rules across the whole EU to constrain and corral sort of, the big tech players in the West. So several years ago, they put in place this pretty sweeping data protection law called a GDPR, which, is effectively extraterritorial in its application to multinationals. And it's been a point of leverage they've used to compel, non-EU firms to abide by their regulations. They're trying to play a similar playbook with AI. Something in particular that they're pushing is the the EU AI Act, which the Parliament has pushed out maybe 2 years or so before it would come into full force. There's a lot of intense negotiation over the actual implementation of that regulation right now, especially given the fact that most of the companies that it applies to are not EU companies. So there's a lot of sort of geopolitics and politics at play, but they're really trying to put in place a framework where they kind of have the commanding heights of kind of the global regulatory regime. Meanwhile, China has put in place their own kind of domestic regime for AI regulation. It's actually taken shape over many years. They've been at the forefront up until this latest breakthrough with large language models. Several years ago, everyone thought China was actually in the lead position when it came to the sort of broad application of AI and machine learning technologies, in particular, things that they've been pioneering with big data for surveillance and monitoring, facial recognition, et cetera, sort of optical based technology. They've really kind of been at the forefront of developing. So until like these large language model breakthroughs with transformer architectures really came out, everyone thought China was kind of going to be in the pole position, and China has been creating their own regulatory apparatus to try to steer development of these technologies in a way that favors themselves. China right now is lagging in terms of the technology side, but they're sort of aggressively trying to catch up as quickly as possible. And this is obviously the subject of intense geopolitical confrontation, as sort of US and its geoeconomic allies and technology partners in that semiconductor and computing sort of infrastructure are trying to block China's ability to kind of climb that ladder effectively, kind of a soft embargo on China's access to that strategic technology supply chain. And so this is really, I think, one of the, critical points of contention in the bilateral relationship. So yeah, I mean, competitive advantage is really what everyone's jockeying for right now. It's clear that in this particular use case of generative AI from these large language models, which really require access to, the most advanced semiconductor compute clusters on the planet, billions of dollars of sort of capital investment and really complex supply chains and really scarce and prized engineering and scientific talent. Like, this is where there's an intense sort of battle underway for supremacy.
Yeah, and it seems to me that it's still very early in the way that this plays out. Since this is ultimately about chips, right? China's got to have some bargaining power, at least from the potential threat of them at some point maybe going into Taiwan. I wonder how you think this kind of arms race in AI might impact timelines for China wanting to maybe do some kind of military act.
Oof, well, that is a multi-trillion-dollar question. See, the motivations for China to conduct sort of armed operations for Taiwan or against Taiwan are very complex, and the relationship of those set of motivations is, I'd say, only indirectly related to the technology war, and therefore only sort of indirectly related to the AI specific sort of subset of that competition. But it does feed into kind of the structural trend that should raise some concern about increasing the chance of some, instability in that security dynamic, which is that China views, one of the premises of the CCP's kind of hold on power is that they can provide economic development to their population. And they have increasingly viewed over the past several years that getting access to strategic technologies and sort of seizing the commanding heights of the sort of core and breakthrough technologies of the 21st century is really critical to their economic development plans, which is critical to the sort of political mandate that they have given to themselves as the party state in charge of the Chinese population. And so if they feel that there's an existential threat to their ability to make good on that economic development process or promise that comes from the fact that they've been sort of systematically excluded and cut off from their ability to sort of capture these strategic technologies, then that, marginally increases, the chance that they decide to, reject the promise of integration with the global system and, embark on a much more risky endeavor to change the economic and security architecture in the Western Pacific and to try to kick the United States out of that position. So it's really complicated. I would say right now, there isn't like an immediate, risk of obviously a Taiwan event, like in the next, say, 8 to 12 months or 24 months. But if you start to see, concerning trend lines intersect over the next 2 to 3 years, where the premise of economic growth starts to falter, where the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China, even if it's on a sort of a cyclical upswing right now, that it sort of continues to deteriorate on a structural basis. And then you consider kind of a continuing trend on both sides of this sort of securitization of economic trade technology policy. And China begins to perceive, much more aggressive attempt by sort of the G7 techno-industrial bloc that has arisen to try to contain it, to see that as a strategic threat to their economic development. And then, that just sort of, I would say like a dry summer doesn't necessarily mean you get a forest fire, but it makes the conditions for a conflagration much more likely. And then you can get, accidents that can quickly spiral if the baseline level of trust and stress in that relationship is very low. And so that would be the concern of the next 2 or 3 years, that especially given the pace of AI sort of emergence as a sort of technological and economic force, that this might increase the sense of urgency inside Beijing, that this isn't a decade-long question of sort of racing to catch up, that they could be seen as, falling behind way too fast. And if they feel like they can't, catch up in sort of traditional ways and try to break the geoeconomic block that U.S. is constructing, then, they might just flip the table. So that is the risk.
So I want to go back to use the term social engineering towards the start of the conversation. I haven't really thought about this at all, but I am sure that this is going to be a major thing to consider for Congress and for lawmakers, which is, we know that there's a degree of social engineering that's happening through apps like TikTok, right? The content that's showed in the US looks different than what TikTok users in China see. I'm going to make the assumption that AI makes that even easier to manipulate messaging for different countries and societies. Is there maybe kind of a whole new worry there about how AI could just really just change the fabric of society, of culture, of more than just sort of the benefits, the downsides of it, and how AI can be used to manipulate us?
Oh, yes. I mean, this has definitely been a concern for many years among sort of policymakers as they, have worried about just the fact that most information is consumed as the product of some algorithm, right? Like Twitter feed, Facebook, most information content is consumed and directed to consumers by algorithms. And so there's been intense debate over many years about, potential manipulation of those algorithms. Obviously, in the commercial world, the manipulation of those algorithms is generally designed to maximize clicks to generate ad revenue. There's an additional kind of worry on the geopolitical scale when the algorithm that is feeding content to your population is being controlled by a foreign power, where they might use that influence for, say, non-economic objectives, right, to sort of shape perceptions among your domestic population about a particular foreign policy issue, or to sort of undermine civic trust, generally speaking, kind of sort of manipulate perceptions in your domestic society. And that is a concern that folks in different policymaking bodies have voiced. It has, I think, manifested in a few different forums, right? So obviously the TikTok ban discussion over a few months ago that kind of gripped Capitol Hill, I think, is somewhat faded, although there's still obviously a lot of action going on behind the scenes. But one of those things that has come out of that was this bill called the Restrict Act that was put forward by Senator Mark Warner, who's the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and a very influential member on kind of these technology policy discussions, especially relating to sort of China's geostrategic competition. And, this was part of the motivation for building this packet of legislation that is obviously by the name of it, like restrict. The whole premise is to restrict sort of the information communication technologies between US and China. It doesn't specifically call out China, but it's basically about China, to essentially try to mitigate, block, or constrain the ability of Chinese companies and Chinese information and communication technology providers from providing services and selling technologies to the United States. And so there's a growing perception. Some folks might see it as more paranoia, but it is a growing sort of policy direction that is seeking to limit the ability of foreign technology service providers, especially ones that control information communication technology, from deploying their services and providing their products into the US market. Let's say TikTok was the cause celeb, with those hearings, but underlying the specific TikTok issue was this broader concern about sort of Chinese platforms, Chinese applications, Chinese sort of hardware, and sort of an increasing need to kind of put national security considerations to the fore when it comes to the whole stack, from hardware production all the way up to sort of applications and services. And this is sort of, leading to a debate right now between sort of how far does this go? How far does this quote unquote decoupling go? If you're paying attention to the news with Secretary Blinken and Secretary Yellen's visit to China, there seems to be a political push to put a floor under the broader relationship that they felt was a bit of a tit for tat security spiral since the balloon incident early this year. And that they have a strategic desire on the political side to kind of get things at least stable enough so that Biden and President Xi can meet in November, and that they have enough deliverables kind of to keep the relationship reasonably solid before the political season of 2024 heats up that could cause things to deteriorate more. And so this perception about technology threat has like an underlying, like material basis, but it has been increasingly politicized and sort of used as a way to try to position on different sides of the political aisle to kind of become the more hawkish, to have kind of more hawkish kind of viewpoint hasn't yet been penalized. And, it's been relatively a bipartisan thing. And so this is, I think, where we're going to see the trajectory, I think, continue to head, is that there's going to, still, I think, going to be a desire, and we're going to see that be executed by Washington to selectively decouple, to really try to drive, intense security considerations into, say, like investment, what right now is called like the outbound investment screening executive order that's underway. It's focused specifically on AI, quantum information technologies, and the semiconductor supply chain. We're going to see that probably, maybe this summer. We'll see. There's intense sort of, lobbying by VC and private equity and Wall Street to try to soften that a bit. But there's a trend that's moving in this direction of, like, you might call it like selective decoupling, where there are strategic technologies that we feel that we need to, ensure where we have our own independent supply chain base, or there's mitigated influence from foreign platforms. And so that's the US perspective. China views this as, somewhat of a canard and essentially these strategic technologies are essential to economic development in the next 5 or 10 years. And that, this quote unquote selective decoupling is really a strategic threat and a challenge to them. And they perceive it as a sort of sub rosa declaration of economic war that's intended to materially hinder their economic development. And so that is what the message from Li Qiang was to Secretary Yellen in the last few days. And so we'll see. I think in the medium term, or the short to medium term, I think there's a desire on both sides to prevent, more tit for tats to spiral out, especially given China's sort of bout of economic weakness recently. But overall, the mandate from President Xi on high is that security is taking precedence over economic considerations. And that has filtered through the bureaucracies and their whole orientation towards economic development, technology, and the relationship with Western capital. So I think we're at a moment that's, I think the strategic direction is somewhat baked, even if the relationship on both sides is managed politically to prevent, crises from breaking out.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I had seen some of that from CNBC earlier this morning, this point about, I think they said a decoupling versus diversification, right? Kind of making it more about diversification as opposed to decoupling, the way to think about it. Was there some catalyst that suddenly changed sort of the way the narrative shifted? I mean, I haven't been tracking this that closely, but it seems to me it's almost like suddenly relationships with China are not going to be as bad as everyone thought, or deglobalization is not going to be as severe as everyone talked about.
Well, I mean, no one knows exactly, but I think just looking at the trend, if you really go back to October of last year, when the United States unveiled the export controls, which were the most significant kind of sweeping official policy that was perceived by China as a sort of a, as I mentioned, like a de facto declaration of economic war designed to constrain their access to the leading strategic technologies, that they perceived as a fundamental obstacle to their economic development. And National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave a speech that was perceived as a shift in sort of the policy stance on a technology competition side, where instead of maintaining kind of a relative lead, it was about making the United States maintain as large a lead as possible over its economic and technology competitors. And so that really kicked off a sort of a bilateral spiral a bit, where this perception of economic containment, the sort of technology blockade, quote unquote, was driving, the relationship, and it was driving it in a very negative way. Secretary Blinken, the Secretary of State, was supposed to go there to maybe help smooth things over, but then the balloon incident happened, and while it was kind of like a weekend of confusion and maybe somewhat of comedy for folks tracking on social media, it forced Secretary Blinken to cancel his visit to China. And that really stung the Chinese. They felt that was kind of an insult. They didn't really like Secretary Blinken personally. They felt he had sort of preached to them. And so there was a lot of bad blood in the mouth for the balloon incident. And then there was like several months of, folks trying to, I think in the back channels, find a way to bring the relationship back to the quote unquote, like, I think it was like the Bali principles, where President Xi and President Biden had sort of met on the sidelines of, I think it was the G20 in Bali. And they had agreed on core principles to structure the relationship. And when you have that kind of set at the national strategic level, it kind of helps, keep the relationship well managed. And then it had kind of fallen off the rails. And so I think what you're seeing now is sort of an attempt on the political side to stitch the relationship at least somewhat back together, but it's coming from a pretty low level. And I think the objective is to, put in place the conditions for the leaders to meet again in November, knowing that there's going to be a Taiwanese election shortly thereafter. And then the U.S. presidential campaign is going to heat up, and it's going to be very hard to, have potentially constructive bilateral overt relationships and engagement in 2024. So I think they want to get things at least as close to an even keel this year. And so that was Secretary Blinken's objective. And then now Secretary Yellen, and then maybe John Kerry will go visit, and there'll probably be a bunch of other bilateral, engagements. Another critical meeting was the CIA director, Burns, went there in May and had a number of secret meetings with a bunch of people there to help smooth things over in a number of different dimensions. And so I don't think it was one big pivot, but I think it was things trying to, the political momentum on both sides. I think there's also a lot of influence by key figures in our domestic political economy that have been pushing for this as well. So we've been tracking like Elon Musk visited and was sort of feted in Shanghai. JP Morgan had their big summit. I think it was in Shanghai as well. And Jamie Dimon went there and was started, talking about how like we should be, this isn't good for business. Basically, we need to kind of keep a strong U.S.-China relationship. Bill Gates went and actually had a one-on-one meeting with President Xi. I think it was about a month ago. And so you've had a number of key figures in sort of the U.S. political economy go over there and try to build quote unquote bridges again. So I think that was a signal from Western capital and business that they did not like the direction of travel of the relationship, that they did not like to see this thing spiral out of control. They're already facing, supply chain considerations as they try to move to a China plus one strategy. But I think the recognition among C-suites is that this is not a short-term fix. The sort of strategic coupling between these two economies and the amount of kind of interdependence that is just not going to be unwound anytime soon. And that the pace of change driven by, say policymakers and security bureaucrats in DC was much faster than what, say, Western capital and business was willing to countenance. And so they, flex some of their political muscle, I think, and sort of slow down the pace of that trend. I think you can even see that in kind of the choice of terminology, right? 6 months ago, it was all about decoupling, and then it went to de-risking, and then now it's diversification. And so I think the sort of semantic shift is an indicator of what you're seeing as at least in the near term, a shift driven by the political economy of the United States, and the fact that, say, Silicon Valley, venture capital, private equity, Wall Street were lobbying the Treasury and DC, and they have pull.
Just to reset the room for the remaining minutes, everybody please make sure you follow Magic Finds here on Twitter if you want to come up and ask questions. click that bottom left mic request button. And as always, this will be a podcast under Lead Lag Live. For whatever it's worth, the whole balloon thing, I'm still convinced that was both the media and the administration fucking with us. Because the first few days when the balloons were getting in the media, the speculation around it being aliens was at a fever pitch, for lack of a better way of saying it. And I know you want to talk about UAPs, but I have to tell you, I always smile when I see all the stuff around UFOs and how it impacts security, when in reality, most of the stuff is, just fantastical. But there have been some interesting headlines when it comes to UAP. So first of all, just for those that are in the audience, Matthew, explain what a UAP technically is and how that factors into some of the work that you do on the security advising front.
Okay, so we're going to do the hard pivot into UAPs. Awesome.
I tried to figure out a way to transition. It's like balloons, you're kind of unidentified aerial.
Yeah, well, I mean, so yeah, if you're sort of following the news, I guess, in a bit of a, like if looking at the balloon incident as the most recent example where, all of a sudden the United States was firing missiles at objects over our airspace for the first time in our history, it was, kind of like a weekend of like what the hell is going on? And then it quickly faded. And there was, not much officially, I think, reported on that. Shortly thereafter, the White House set up a working group at the principals level. So at the level of national security, led by the National Security Advisor, with the membership of the Secretary of State, Defense, Director of National Intelligence, et cetera, specifically to help, to focus on what are called unidentified anomalous phenomena. And I won't go through the whole rigmarole of the past several years, but I would encourage folks to take a look at what the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has been doing over the past few years with inserting provisions into the National Defense Authorization Act and the Intelligence Authorization Act, increasingly turning up the heat on the Defense Department and the intelligence community to do more reporting and investigation on what are called unidentified and anomalous phenomena. So these are objects that we have detected displaying advanced performance characteristics. And it's becoming an increasingly, a salient topic of discourse inside the Beltway. I think you're going to see more coming out over the course of the summer on this. I believe maybe this week, even the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee is going to introduce the same language into defense authorization provisions that all basically will sort of point in the same direction of requiring more transparency on this topic, and specifically relating to, I think the language that's going to be in the bill will be, quote, non-Earth origin or exotic technology. And they want to open up access to, quote, exotic technology historical antecedents that have been previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. So there's a lot going on that. It sounds a little bit of a non sequitur given the topics we were just discussing. I think they might become increasingly salient over the next few months as the Senate and other policymakers start to become more vocal and specific in bringing this up as a topic of public discourse. The one connection to China that I found interesting was Representative Mike Gallagher, who is a congressman from Wisconsin. He's a sharp guy, PhD, military intelligence officer. He was recently tapped to be the chair of the Select Committee on China. And so he has really tried to position himself kind of at the center of what we were just spending the first 30 minutes discussing, which is sort of the strategic competition with China. And he's been, pretty hawkish and pretty focused in making this kind of his issue. I think there's an expectation that he's politically ambitious, maybe even a presidential candidate sometime in the near future, maybe 2028, we'll see. And he, so he's like a serious policymaker. He's trying to put himself at the center of, these emerging strategic issues. And I'll just note that he has also been one of, I'd say, the most vocal and explicit political leaders on the House side on the UAP topic. And I found it noteworthy that he went on the nationally syndicated radio show called the Pat McAfee Show. It's like basically kind of sports. It's got a pretty big kind of middle America sort of listener base. And he spent about 40 minutes of that show just focused on trying to educate and normalize the topic of UAPs in this audience of, folks that are listening to, like discussion of the NFL draft. And so I thought that was interesting. And he even explicitly mentioned during that interview a desire to get this topic into the presidential conversation for 2024, which I thought that was very curious, very somewhat unusual given his otherwise, like he's got a lot of other things on his plate, right? He's supposed to be leading kind of the policy conversation around competing with China from the perspective of the House as, a person with presidential aspirations. It seems odd that he would spend so much time focused on this issue. But he is he's introduced bills on the House side that mirror some of the language that I was just talking about that has these somewhat eye-opening references to non-Earth origin technology. So I just would encourage folks to maybe keep an open mind for now and pay attention to some of these legislative maneuvers coming out of the Senate.
I hope the majority of non-Earth technologies landed on U.S. soil and not in China. If that's the case, I mean, again, this stuff sounds fantastical, but it does seem, to your point, that it's getting more out there in the narrative. I mean, YouTube itself suddenly is recommending, and I've never once searched for UFO or outside of Earth technology, and I'm getting some of these videos being pushed on me. I don't know if it's coincidental, but
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the other thing, right? Like, you need to be a discerning epistemic consumer of information, not only on this topic, but on any other topic. It is I would describe it to you, you're in the middle of a forest clearing and there's certain information that you can have sort of decently high credences on. And I think that's where you should focus. And then there's the dark forest where folks love to go wandering off and speculating in all sorts of different directions, but it's easy to get lost in the dark forest and not find your way back. And yeah, so I sort of would focus folks on the sort of objective, easily verified aspects of this issue, which are what is the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence actually doing? Who have they talked to? What bills and legislative language has already been passed? What additional legislation is also coming up soon? These are serious people, putting in place serious legislative requirements on a topic. And that's where I would start. And then, just be open-minded about these other things as they develop.
speaking of transitions, I'm trying to think of a way to get this to go to Bitcoin. And I think the way to frame it is, what is the bigger threat to national security? AI or UAPs or Bitcoin? Right. So maybe we'll use that as a transition. But I do want to I know you're a Bitcoin advocate, obviously, and you've talked about it in other podcasts you've done involved with Bitcoin, National Fellow, Bitcoin Policy Institute. Just talk about for the audience just why you got attracted to Bitcoin and talk about some of the national security implications on being a leader when it comes to Bitcoin and blockchain technology.
Yeah, we're really doing these hard left turns. But
I'm trying.
I'll stick with the.
I'll tell you something real quick. Like, I don't really. Maybe people are going to say, like, obviously, but I don't really prep too much for these conversations.
Oh no, I'm for it.
And it's like just kind of go with it, right? So anyway,
yeah, no, I'm all for it. Yes, I would step back and say, so my professional background is I sort of helped the government for a number of years examine, say, low probability, high consequence events. So whether that was geopolitics, disasters, emerging technology, nuclear war. So my mental framework and professional experience has sort of always kept me attuned to things in the tails, or sort of things that may be sort of, outside the current Overton window of either policy discourse or expectations about, say, the median forecast for technology development or geopolitical dynamics. And so I always try to play as safely as I can in those tails. Obviously, those tails are very sort of tricky places to play because, you're in the poorly sampled part of the distribution. And if you don't have like a solid either risk management framework or analytical framework, you can make a lot of strategic errors. So that's like a caution, but I guess my background has always made me feel more comfortable kind of playing in that part of the probability distribution. And that's, I think, what stitches sort of all three of those issues together, right? AI, UAPs, and Bitcoin, is that they are all topics and, from some mental framework that are all kind of, coming in from the tails. And obviously AI, I think, is one example of where a few years ago would be considered sort of fringe. Like, you were really in the fringe kind of internet forums if you're speculating about an AI superintelligence kind of taking over humanity and posing an existential threat to our civilization. And I think what you've seen is like a radical revision of what's considered like a safe topic of political discourse in the AI conversation. And, just given the pace of change of the technology. And now you have, leading figures in the technology, like Jeffrey Hinton, who came from Google and basically was warning about existential risk. You had folks signing this letter, Elon Musk. It's actually now like a topic of conversation among policymakers about like what are the risks of AI, both like tactical geopolitical risks, but also these kind of left tail existential risks from this technology. It's like a serious subject. And I think, that's just a case study of where you can have an issue come from pretty fringy niche area and, come into the center of the sort of Overton window pretty quickly. And I think that should be just a case study of where we should draw lessons in other topics, not to say that they'll necessarily follow the same trajectory, but I think they should caution us, right? Same thing with the pandemic, right? If you're paying attention to early reports out of Wuhan in January of 2020, right? You could have been caught by either strategic surprise, or you could have been ahead of the curve if you had a mental model that thought about the exponential processes of a viral transmission network. And so that is a segue to Bitcoin, which is maybe a larger conversation about the geostrategic economic implications of, say, non-state money system. I would say that the framework I sort of have for thinking about Bitcoin on a geopolitical level is, fundamentally not as a threat to the dollar, but fundamentally as an alternative reserve asset that provides interesting diversification benefits to our economy, given sort of increasing geopolitical competition over the structure of the monetary arrangement. And that fundamentally, U.S. economic power for the past 75 years has been premised on our control over the global monetary system, both the fundamental plumbing, right? So the choke point and surveillance power that we get from, basically dominance over the correspondent banking system and the use of the dollar as the medium of exchange and unit of account for, global trade and, say swaps and forwards, interest rate derivatives. That gives us a strategic advantage, allows us to, coerce and compel our adversaries in pretty significant ways. But we're sort of, coming to a point where, the geoeconomic bloc led by China through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS thing, I think is a bit overplayed, but there's a clear desire among geoeconomic adversaries of the United States to challenge the global economic arrangement and the monetary structure that underpins it. So China has, a pretty sophisticated objective to sort of, follow a similar strategy they've done in the past in other domains to block, build, and expand their power in the monetary arena. And so they've done this, right, say in the military arena. First, they wanted to block the ability of the U.S. to project power through the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea with, anti-access denial systems that they've, progressively expanded. And so that is a strategy I think they're trying to follow in the monetary arena, where they first want to just block the ability of the West to geoeconomically coerce them, sanction them, use other levers of financial constraint. And so that to sort of route around that, China's been trying to construct these alternative nascent arrangements through things like SIPs, through the try to sort of roll out and internationalize the digital yuan with cross-bridge CBDCs through, like, say, Project Mbridge, mainly using central banks in South Asia and the Middle East as kind of key partners. And essentially they're trying to bootstrap a competing monetary network using their trade network, right? So you can imagine if Facebook is trying to bootstrap a social network using their existing Instagram network, China's trying to bootstrap this monetary network using their existing trade network, but coming from a position of strategic disadvantage. So I position Bitcoin as this interesting alternative open monetary system that functions also as a reserve asset that provides potentially the United States a geoeconomic advantage in the global South, where these countries that China is trying to court into their political ambit and to sort of coerce and co-opt them through things like Belt and Road Initiative, through the sort of which we call it like techno-authoritarianism as a service stack from Huawei, ZTE, and the digital yuan and cross-bridge CBDCs. It's really trying to sort of pull a whole bunch of countries in, say, the emerging markets and developing countries into a security, economic, and technological structure that they dominate. And we don't have a whole lot to compete with on that specific basis, right? And so we just have the dollar itself as a medium of exchange, but a lot of countries are exposed to, monetary policy, the sort of the bullwhip that ricochets around the world, given their exposure to dollar leverage. And so you can imagine the sort of combination of dollar-based stablecoins that are, decently regulated in Bitcoin having a synergistic effect that provides access to the dollar as a unit of account in countries that are not currently dollarized. And it also gives them access to a savings vehicle in Bitcoin that their, say, host governments that may not be as democratically inclined, it's harder for those host governments to seize or coerce their domestic population. So to the extent the United States has an interest in, spreading individual autonomy, property rights, and the dollar in the global South, Bitcoin dollar-based stablecoins kind of act as an open source kind of bottom-up organic technology development that, it reinforces those foreign policy and human rights objectives at the same time that it helps to counter China's geoeconomic and sort of technology capture objectives in those same countries that are the front lines of what you would call Cold War 2.0. So there's a long, complicated, somewhat speculative kind of thesis around the role of Bitcoin and dollar-based stablecoins in this era of increasing geopolitical and monetary competition. I think it's an area that I think is underexplored, and so I just like to throw it out there for policy consideration.
At KSG, what are some of the things that you've been observing kind of more regularly among clients you're advising as far as concerned around new emerging types of risks or threats on the cybersecurity front or on the geopolitical side?
Oh, yes. So certainly our clients have come to us for all of their, say, hard problems when it comes to navigating a global landscape that presents strategic challenges that intersect their geopolitical risk, their cybersecurity risk, and their business strategy. And China has obviously loomed, I'd say, the largest in those conversations. So we've had a lot of pretty interesting problem sets to help them navigate when it comes to the, let's say, your network architecture, right, was maybe designed for a world that was reasonably flat, that had a premise of kind of seamless data and personnel sort of fungibility across borders, especially in China, and that you could sort of structure your enterprise, your data flows, and your business strategy around that idea of, essentially one global network. And I think multinationals have been, reconfiguring themselves for a world where that is no longer the case, where you have to sort of segment, separate, and restructure not just like your business strategy or even like your corporate structure, but like the actual data flows, the network architecture, the enterprise systems for that world. And that is that's kind of a expensive and messy process, right? Building those systems took 20 years. And a lot of those executives got to positions of leadership in these multinationals by helping to expand in China and build these global networks that, gave them economies of scale and efficiency and fungibility of staff and information and sort of knowledge transfer. And so it's hard, both psychologically as well as just practically, to sort of try to unwind or restructure some of those operations. So we do a lot of consulting on those questions, right? How to think about, say, network architecture, segmentation, data localization in a world where you have to navigate increasingly contentious geopolitical environment. And China is obviously, I think, one of the bigger zones of concern from the C-suite perspective. We're also doing a lot of engagements related to like, okay, well, if we go out of China or if we try to do a China plus one, or we segment, like, what are the collateral implications of this for our risk profile? So if we're moving into other countries that we haven't been operating before, what new risks are we exposed to that we weren't thinking about before? And if we have to do these things relatively fast, right, that's usually when mistakes happen. We're also doing a lot increasingly on AI risk management. So the two, I'd say, foundational questions that are confronting the C-suites now and probably for the next, year or two are, how do I manage my China risk? And how do I manage sort of AI integration into my enterprise while managing that risk properly? And everyone has a, quote unquote AI risk framework. Deloitte, McKinsey, and Accenture and all these big professional services consulting firms, are coming out with, the PowerPoint decks with all the fancy graphics on how to think about, incorporating AI. But it creates a whole new set of kind of security risk control questions. And usually when you're doing things quickly, usually when you're racing to catch up with what you think your competitor is, that's when you introduce security risk into your organization. And, we're, thinking actively about how to try to close that gap as quickly as possible while not being a brake on innovation and sort of market competitiveness. And so we're doing a lot on sort of those two things. I say China de-risking and AI risk management are the two big ones. We also do a lot of specialized kind of question specific issues for companies that are kind of in the geopolitical bullseye. So, while the political headlines kind of come and go, the structural trend lines, I think, are firmly in place. And in particular, the economic espionage and cybersecurity threat to Western multinationals is not going away. And if you are in, what China views as, critical industries for its industrial technology development or for economic espionage purposes, then you are the target of a very advanced and capable sort of cyber threat actor. And so helping organizations that may not have fully appreciated the risk they face from that type of threat actor understand what that risk is, sort of what their threat models are, where it actually comes from, what are the drivers of that risk, sort of what they can, how they're currently postured for that organizationally and technically, and what they can sort of do to mitigate it. And a lot of this is, in firms that are in either critical infrastructure or in emerging technologies that are of strategic interest, both the United States and China. And so helping them think through how to, close some of those gaps in a cost-effective way is a lot of what occupies our time too. So I'll shout out to Dakota Carey in the audience there. He's my China consigliere. So all the things I say about China, I'm just basically refracting whatever he tells me.
Matt, for those who want to track more of your work or want to just kind of pick your brain on things aside from Twitter, are there other places you point them to?
No, I just sort of think in public on Twitter. Twitter is where I sort of rip about, I'd say a wider range of subjects that occupy me professionally, right? Professionally, certainly if you're a C-suite or you're in sort of information security or strategy position or risk position and you're interested or you have, questions or concerns, any of those topics, whether it's China, AI risk management, digital supply chains, et cetera, that, yeah, certainly reach out to me in a professional capacity. We're at the Krebs Stamos group. If you certainly want to riff on anything, Bitcoin, UAPs, feel free to hit me up on Twitter.
Good place to wrap this Twitter space up. Again, this will be a podcast under Lead Lag Live. Thank you, Matthew. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.